The smoke had barely cleared from the last auto-da-fe when a merchant's daughter in Seville picked up a forbidden book and began to read by candlelight. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from the intoxicating danger of the words themselves, words that questioned, that probed, that dared to think beyond the walls that had imprisoned minds for centuries. This simple act, multiplied across 1,000 cities and towns, would crack open the iron cage of fear that had enclosed Europe's soul. For 3 centuries, the Inquisition had cast its shadow across the continent like a permanent eclipse. Its machinery of terror, the informants, the tribunals, the torture chambers, the pyres, had created a civilization built on whispers and suspicion, where the wrong word could mean death and the wrong thought could condemn not just you but your entire family. Yet history has a peculiar way of surprising us. The very intensity of that oppression, the absolute nature of that control, contained within it the seeds of an equally powerful liberation. When the grip finally loosened, when the last flames died down and the smoke dispersed, Europe didn't simply return to what it had been before. It emerged transformed, blinking in the light, ready to breathe deeply and sing in voices it had forgotten it possessed. The decline of the Inquisition was neither sudden nor uniform. It crept across Europe in stages, withdrawing first from one region, then another, leaving behind populations that had to relearn the most basic human activities. How to speak freely, how to question, how to trust. The Protestant Reformation had already fractured the religious unity that the Inquisition was designed to protect, making its mission increasingly anachronistic. The Enlightenment philosophers circulated ideas that made the whole edifice of religious persecution seem barbaric and absurd. Political changes, wars, revolutions, the reorganization of empires, shifted power away from ecclesiastical courts towards secular authorities who had little interest in hunting heretics. But statistics and dates cannot capture what it meant to live through this transition. Imagine growing up in a world where your neighbor might report you for the slightest deviation from orthodoxy, where a slip of the tongue at dinner could lead to arrest, where books were burned and thinkers fled in terror. Then imagine that world gradually, almost imperceptibly loosening its grip. The changes came so slowly that many didn't notice them at first. A trial delayed, a sentence commuted, an informant ignored. But eventually, people began to realize that the monster that had terrorized their grandparents was losing its teeth. In Spain, where the Inquisition had been most powerful and persistent, the institution officially ended only in 1834, though its power had been waning for decades. The last execution for heresy had occurred in 1826, but by then, the practice had become so rare, so out of step with the times, that it shocked even those who had lived under the Inquisition's rule. The machinery remained, but it had become a rusted relic, occasionally producing a mechanical wheeze, but no longer capable of the systematic terror it had once unleashed. The immediate aftermath was characterized by a strange mixture of relief, confusion, and caution. People who had spent their entire lives watching their words suddenly found themselves uncertain about what they were allowed to say. The psychological scars ran deep. In conversations, there would be pauses where people stopped themselves mid-sentence, old habits of self-censorship kicking in, before they remembered that the danger had passed. Trust had to be rebuilt, word by word, conversation by conversation. In the universities, the transformation was particularly dramatic. For generations, theology had dominated every field of study. Philosophy was a handmaiden to religious doctrine. Science was required to confirm scriptural truth, and history was written to glorify the church. Professors had learned to navigate elaborate systems of acceptable thought, dancing around dangerous ideas with the skill of acrobats. The removal of inquisitorial oversight didn't immediately change the curriculum. Institutional inertia is powerful, but it changed the atmosphere. Questions that would have been unthinkable began to appear in lectures. Debates that would have ended in denunciation became spirited intellectual exchanges. One Spanish professor, who had spent his career teaching Thomistic philosophy with careful orthodoxy, reportedly broke down weeping in his classroom when he realized he could finally discuss Spinoza openly. He was an old man by then, and the freedom came too late for him to fully enjoy, but he told his students that just knowing it was possible made his entire career of caution worthwhile. His tears were for the ideas he might have explored, the questions he might have asked, the intellectual life he might have lived, if fear hadn't been his constant companion. The cultural explosion that followed was not immediate, but when it came, it was remarkable. Literature had suffered perhaps more than any other art form under the Inquisition. Writers had either fled to Protestant countries, written in careful allegory that few could penetrate, or simply stopped writing. The index of prohibited books had grown to absurd proportions, banning not just heretical works but any literature that showed too much imagination, too much worldliness, too much human passion. The result was a centuries-long period of cultural drought, where Spanish and Italian literature, which had once led Europe, fell far behind the literary production of France, England, and Germany. When the restrictions lifted, there was an initial period of experimentation that bordered on chaos. Writers drunk on freedom produced works that pushed every boundary, sometimes more for the sake of provocation than artistic merit. But from this creative ferment emerged genuine masterpieces. Historical novels that explored the Inquisition itself became a genre, allowing populations to process their collective trauma through story. These works ranged from melodramatic tales of innocent victims to more nuanced explorations of how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. The arts more generally experienced a renaissance. Painting, which had been restricted largely to religious subjects under inquisitorial control, exploded into secular themes. Artists painted the human body without shame, explored mythology without apology, depicted contemporary life without needing to attach a moral lesson. Music moved out of the churches and into concert halls, where composers experimented with forms and harmonies that would have been considered dangerously innovative just decades before. Theatre, which had always been suspect to religious authorities, flourished with particular vigor. Playhouses that had been closed or heavily censored reopened. Actors who had fled to more liberal cities returned home. The stage became a place where society could examine itself, question its assumptions, and laugh at its absurdities. Comedies mocked the old order with increasing boldness. Tragedies explored themes of conscience and freedom that would have been impossible during the Inquisition's height. But the transformation went deeper than culture. The entire social fabric began to shift. The Inquisition had maintained power partly through a network of informants, neighbors spying on neighbors, servants reporting on masters, children encouraged to denounce their parents. This system had poisoned social relations, creating a society where trust was foolish and isolation was safe. The end of the Inquisition meant these networks dissolved, but the suspicion and atomization they created didn't disappear immediately. Communities had to actively rebuild social bonds. In some towns, there were formal reconciliation processes, though these were rare and often ineffective. More commonly, reconciliation happened through the mundane activities of daily life, neighbors helping each other, families reuniting, friendships forming without the shadow of denunciation. It was slow work, this rebuilding of trust, and in some places, it never fully succeeded. There were families that remained estranged for generations, towns where certain families were never quite forgiven for their roles as informants. The economic impact of the Inquisition's end was substantial, though often overlooked. The persecution of conversos, Jews forced to convert to Christianity, but suspected of secretly maintaining their faith, had driven many of Europe's most skilled merchants, bankers, and artisans into exile or underground existence. The elimination of this persecution allowed talent to emerge from hiding. Businesses that had operated in the shadows could work openly. Capital that had been hidden or sent abroad could be invested domestically. Spain, in particular, had suffered economically from the Inquisition. While Dutch merchants built trading empires, and English manufacturers pioneered industrial techniques, Spain had been busy investigating the genealogies of its citizens to root out anyone with Jewish or Muslim ancestry. The result was a brain drain that gutted the economy. When these restrictions ended, Spain attempted to modernize rapidly, but it had fallen too far behind. The economic gap between Spain and its northern European neighbors, created partly by the Inquisition's persecution, would persist for centuries. The intellectual awakening was perhaps the most profound change. For generations, the Inquisition had kept Europe's Catholic regions in a state of enforced ignorance about scientific and philosophical developments. While Galileo was forced to recant his support for heliocentrism, Protestant countries were building observatories and teaching Copernican astronomy in their universities. While Descartes fled to the Netherlands to publish his philosophy, Spain was still teaching medieval logic as though nothing had changed since Thomas Aquinas. The removal of inquisitorial censorship allowed a flood of previously forbidden ideas to enter Catholic countries. Universities suddenly had access to decades or centuries of scientific and philosophical work. Professors had to rapidly educate themselves about developments they had missed. Students discovered that entire fields of knowledge had been hidden from them. There was a hunger for learning that was almost desperate as people realized how much had been kept from them. Scientific societies sprang up in cities that had been intellectual backwaters during the Inquisition. Amateur scientists conducted experiments that would have been dangerous during the period of religious control. Museums opened, displaying natural specimens and scientific instruments without needing to frame everything in terms of religious doctrine. Observatories were built not just for navigation, but for the pure pursuit of astronomical knowledge. The reception of Darwin's theory of evolution in the late 19th century illustrated how far things had come. While the theory was controversial everywhere, and while the Catholic Church officially opposed it, there was nothing like the inquisitorial response that would have greeted such an idea centuries earlier. Scientists in Catholic countries could discuss evolution, publish papers about it, and teach it, even if the Church disapproved. The separation between scientific and religious authority, which would have been unthinkable during the Inquisition's height, had become an accepted fact. Philosophy experienced perhaps the most dramatic renaissance. The Inquisition had essentially frozen Catholic philosophy in the medieval period, making any departure from Aristotelian Thomistic thought extremely dangerous. The post-Inquisition era saw Catholic philosophers rapidly trying to catch up with centuries of development. They encountered Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, Kant, all thinkers whose work had been forbidden or heavily censored. The initial response was often hostile, but gradually Catholic thinkers began engaging seriously with modern philosophy, sometimes adopting it, sometimes critiquing it, but always engaging with it in ways that would have been impossible before. The development of a free press was revolutionary. During the Inquisition, all publications required approval from church censors. Books went through elaborate review processes, with passages deleted or rewritten to satisfy religious authorities. Newspapers, where they existed, were careful to avoid any content that might be considered heretical or immoral. The result was a press that was timid, predictable, and boring. The emergence of truly independent newspapers and journals transformed public discourse. Political debates that had been conducted in whispers could now happen in print. Scientific findings could be disseminated widely. Literary criticism, book reviews, and cultural commentary created a public sphere that had barely existed during the Inquisition. Not everyone welcomed this development. Authorities who had grown comfortable with censorship often tried to reimpose it, though rarely with the religious justification that the Inquisition had used. The press also served an important function in helping societies process their experience of the Inquisition. Newspapers published accounts of trials. Historians wrote articles analyzing the institution's methods and impact, and survivors told their stories in print. This public reckoning, while never complete, helped break the silence that had surrounded the Inquisition's operations. Seeing the methods described in cold print, reading testimony from victims, learning the statistics of persecution, all of this helped demystify the institution and make it clear that the terror had been human-made and therefore could be human-ended. Religious life itself underwent profound changes. The Catholic Church, having lost the Inquisition as a tool of enforcement, had to find new ways of maintaining orthodoxy and unity. Some church leaders wanted to create new forms of control, but increasingly they recognized that the age of enforcing belief through fear had ended. The Church began, slowly and reluctantly, to emphasize persuasion over coercion, education over persecution. This didn't mean the church became liberal or tolerant by modern standards. Conservative churchmen still condemned modernism, fought against secular education, and opposed religious freedom. But they did so through argument and political maneuvering rather than torture and execution. The difference mattered. You could disagree with the church without fearing for your life. You could leave the faith without expecting the stake. This represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between religious authority and individual conscience. For many believers, the end of the Inquisition was actually liberating. They could practice their faith without the constant fear that some aspect of their devotion might be judged insufficient or suspicious. Religious life could be genuine rather than performative. People could ask questions about doctrine without fear. The relationship with God could be personal rather than mediated entirely through hierarchies of ecclesiastical control. The Protestant regions that had created their own versions of religious enforcement, Geneva under Calvin, Scotland under Knox, Massachusetts under the Puritans, also experienced similar liberalizations, though often earlier than Catholic regions. The pattern was similar: initial severe enforcement of religious conformity, gradual recognition that this was counterproductive, slow movement toward toleration, eventual acceptance of religious pluralism. The timeline varied, but the direction was consistent. Education underwent a revolution. During the Inquisition, education had been controlled almost entirely by the church. The curriculum was designed to produce orthodox believers who knew their catechism, accepted church authority, and didn't ask dangerous questions. Critical thinking was actively discouraged. Classical texts were read only in carefully censored editions. Science was taught only insofar as it confirmed religious doctrine. The post-Inquisition era saw the gradual secularization of education. State-run schools began to compete with church schools. Universities gained autonomy from ecclesiastical control. The curriculum expanded to include subjects that had been neglected or forbidden. Students learned to question, to debate, to think independently. This didn't happen overnight or without resistance, but it happened. The impact on subsequent generations was enormous. Children educated in this new system grew up with fundamentally different assumptions about authority, knowledge, and truth. They were taught that evidence mattered, that questions were valuable, that disagreement was acceptable. When these students became adults, they created a society that was more dynamic, more innovative, and more free than what had existed before. Women's experience of the post-Inquisition period was complex. During the Inquisition, women had been particular targets, especially those who were too independent, too educated, or too outspoken. Accusations of witchcraft often targeted women who didn't conform to narrow gender roles. The Inquisition had enforced a vision of womanhood that was passive, obedient, and confined to domestic roles. The end of the Inquisition didn't immediately liberate women. Patriarchal structures remained firmly in place, but it did remove one particularly effective tool for controlling women. Without the threat of being denounced for witchcraft or immorality, women had slightly more room to maneuver. Some women used this opening to pursue education, to engage in business, to write and publish. The improvements were modest by modern standards, but they represented real change from the inquisitorial period. Women writers in particular benefited. During the Inquisition, women who wrote risked denunciation for immodesty or for spreading dangerous ideas. The few women who did publish often used male pseudonyms or claimed divine inspiration to avoid charges of presumption. After the Inquisition, while prejudice against women writers certainly persisted, the stakes were lower. Women could publish under their own names without fearing the stake. Literary salons hosted by women became important cultural institutions where ideas could be exchanged freely. The fate of former inquisitors and their collaborators raised difficult questions about justice and reconciliation. Some of the more notorious figures fled or went into hiding as the institution's power waned. Others remained in place, often moving into other positions in the church or civil administration. There was rarely any systematic attempt to hold former inquisitors accountable for their actions. They had, after all, been acting within the law as it existed at the time, carrying out duties assigned to them by both church and state. This lack of accountability troubled some people then, and continues to be debated by historians. Victims and their descendants often felt that justice had not been served, that those who had caused so much suffering should face consequences. But others argued that pursuing old grievances would prevent healing and reconciliation. The result was a messy, unsatisfying compromise where some acknowledgement of wrongdoing occurred, but few individuals faced any real consequences. The debate over historical memory continues to this day. How should societies remember the Inquisition? Some wanted to forget, to move forward without looking back. Others insisted on preservation of memory as a warning for future generations. The result has been uneven. In some places, careful historical work has documented the Inquisition's operations and honored its victims. In others, a kind of collective amnesia has set in, with the Inquisition becoming a vague historical abstraction rather than a reality that destroyed countless lives. Architecture bears witness to this period of transition. The buildings that housed inquisitorial tribunals, the courtrooms, the prisons, the torture chambers, presented a particular problem. Some were destroyed immediately as populations vented their fury on the physical structures of oppression. Others were converted to new uses, becoming ordinary government offices or museums. Walking through these spaces today, knowing what happened within their walls, creates a particular feeling, a mixture of horror at what occurred and relief that it's over. Monuments to victims have been erected in some places, though often long after the fact. These memorials serve multiple functions. They acknowledge suffering, they educate new generations, and they serve as warnings. The inscriptions vary, but they often emphasize themes of tolerance, freedom of conscience, and the dangers of religious fanaticism. Whether such monuments actually prevent future atrocities is debatable, but they at least ensure that the victims are not forgotten. The legal legacy of the Inquisition was equally important. The inquisitorial courts had operated under principles that violated what we now consider basic legal rights: secret accusations, torture to obtain confessions, presumption of guilt, denial of adequate defense. The end of the Inquisition allowed legal reformers to push for changes that would prevent such abuses in the future. The principle of habeas corpus, the right to confront one's accusers, the prohibition of torture, the presumption of innocence, all of these were strengthened partly in reaction to inquisitorial practices. Modern human rights law owes something to the memory of the Inquisition. When the United Nations drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, the framers were conscious of historical atrocities, including religious persecution. Articles protecting freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, prohibiting torture and cruel punishment, and guaranteeing fair trials were written partly to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that the Inquisition represented. The psychological impact of the Inquisition on European consciousness is difficult to measure but probably profound. The trauma of living under constant surveillance and the threat of denunciation does not disappear immediately when the danger passes. Some scholars have argued that the Inquisition created patterns of conformity, distrust, and authoritarianism that persisted long after the institution ended. Others dispute this, noting that countries that experienced severe inquisitorial control later became democracies like any other. What is clear is that the memory of the Inquisition became a powerful cultural touchstone. For Enlightenment philosophers, it exemplified everything wrong with religious authority and superstition. For liberals, it demonstrated the need for separation of church and state. For anti-clerical movements, it justified their hostility to church power. The Inquisition became a symbol, invoked whenever someone wanted to warn against the dangers of fanaticism, intolerance, or authoritarian control. This symbolic use of the Inquisition has sometimes obscured the historical reality. In popular imagination, the Inquisition is often portrayed in exaggerated terms, with victims vastly more numerous than they actually were and methods more uniformly brutal than the historical record supports. While the Inquisition was certainly terrible, and while thousands did die in agony, the actual number of victims and the specific practices varied considerably across time and place. Correcting these exaggerations doesn't minimize the real harm done, but it does allow for more accurate understanding. The comparison with other systems of terror and control is instructive. The 20th century saw totalitarian regimes that killed on a scale that dwarfed the Inquisition. The Holocaust, Stalin's purges, Mao's Cultural Revolution, these demonstrated that religious fanaticism wasn't the only source of systematic persecution. In some ways, secular ideologies proved even more deadly than religious ones, precisely because they lacked any notion of eternal judgment or divine mercy to check their violence. Yet the Inquisition retains its power as a historical warning. Perhaps this is because it combined religious sanction with state power in a particularly insidious way, or because it persisted for so many centuries, or because it targeted people for their thoughts rather than their actions. Whatever the reason, the Inquisition remains a reference point in debates about freedom, tolerance, and the proper limits of authority. The gradual embrace of religious toleration in Europe was one of the most significant consequences of the Inquisition's decline. The wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries had demonstrated the impossibility of enforcing religious unity by force. The Enlightenment provided philosophical justifications for tolerance. The practical need for social peace gave political reasons to accept religious diversity. The combination produced a gradual shift from persecution to toleration to acceptance of pluralism. This didn't happen smoothly or universally. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries, religious minorities faced discrimination and sometimes persecution. But the trajectory was clear. Europe was moving away from enforced religious conformity toward acceptance of diversity. The Inquisition came to be seen as an embarrassing relic of a less enlightened age, something to be studied as a cautionary tale rather than emulated. The Catholic Church's own reckoning with the Inquisition has been long and incomplete. For centuries, the Church defended the Inquisition as a necessary tool for protecting the faith and maintaining social order. Criticism of the Inquisition was seen as attack on the Church itself. This defensive posture began to soften only in the 20th century, particularly after the Second Vatican Council, which emphasized religious freedom and dialogue rather than coercion. Pope John Paul II, near the end of the 20th century, made several gestures toward acknowledging past wrongs, including holding a Day of Pardon in 2000 that addressed various historical sins, including the Inquisition. These gestures were significant, but also carefully limited. The Church acknowledged that individuals within the institution had sinned, but stopped short of condemning the Inquisition itself as fundamentally wrong. This nuanced position satisfied neither critics who wanted full acknowledgement, nor traditionalists who saw any criticism as betrayal. The opening of Inquisition archives in recent decades has allowed historians to study the institution with unprecedented detail. These records, trial transcripts, correspondence, administrative documents, reveal the daily operations of the Inquisition with sometimes chilling precision. We can now trace individual cases from denunciation through interrogation to verdict and punishment. We can see how bureaucratic systems of terror operated, how ordinary people became complicit, how some individuals resisted while others collaborated. This historical work has complicated simplistic narratives about the Inquisition. It turns out that some local populations supported the Inquisition, seeing it as protecting community values. Some accused people manipulated the system to escape punishment. Some inquisitors showed occasional mercy, while others were uniformly harsh. The reality was messy, human, and variable in ways that don't fit neatly into either apologetic or condemnatory frameworks. But the complexity shouldn't obscure the fundamental judgment. The Inquisition was wrong. It violated human dignity, destroyed lives, and poisoned society. It created a climate of fear that stunted intellectual and cultural development. It gave religious sanction to cruelty and called it virtue. The end of the Inquisition, however it came about, and however messy the transition, was a liberation. The cultural flowering that followed proved what had been lost. Within decades of the Inquisition's decline, regions that had been cultural backwaters began producing significant art, literature, and science. The talent had always been there, but it had been suppressed or driven into exile or channeled into safe, uncreative directions. Once freed, it burst forth with remarkable energy. Spain provides perhaps the clearest example. Having dominated European culture in the 16th century, with writers like Cervantes and painters like El Greco, Spain then fell into relative cultural decline as the Inquisition tightened its grip. By the 18th century, Spain was importing its culture from France and Italy. But in the 19th century, after the Inquisition's power had waned, Spanish culture revived. Artists like Goya captured the nation's soul with unprecedented honesty and power. Writers explored Spain's past and present with new freedom. Italy followed a similar pattern. Venice, which had resisted inquisitorial control somewhat more successfully than other Italian cities, maintained a vibrant cultural life throughout the period. But Rome, the Inquisition's headquarters, became creatively stagnant. The removal of censorship and the unification of Italy in the 19th century brought cultural revival, with Italian artists and writers engaging with modernism and producing work of international significance. The experience of Jewish communities offers particular insight into the post-Inquisition period. Jews had been the Inquisition's original primary target, with conversos, forced converts and their descendants, remaining under suspicion for generations. The Inquisition's decline coincided with gradual Jewish emancipation across Europe. Jews gained citizenship rights, could practice their religion openly, and could participate in civic life without conversion. This didn't mean anti-Semitism disappeared, far from it, but the particular form of persecution that the Inquisition represented ended. Jews no longer had to practice their faith in secret or live in constant fear of denunciation. Communities that had been destroyed or scattered could reconstitute themselves. Sephardic Jews, descendants of those expelled from Spain and Portugal centuries earlier, could finally begin to heal from that historic trauma. The relationship between Protestant and Catholic regions also shifted after the Inquisition. During the height of religious conflict, these were often literally at war. Catholic Spain and Protestant England, Catholic France and Protestant Netherlands, these rivalries were existential and brutal. The decline of religious persecution on both sides, for Protestants had their own versions of intolerance, allowed for more normal diplomatic and cultural relations. Trade increased between formerly hostile regions. Ideas circulated more freely. Artists and scientists could visit or relocate to regions with different religious affiliations without fearing persecution. This cross-pollination enriched everyone. Protestant science benefited from Catholic insights. Catholic art learned from Protestant innovations. The walls that religion had erected between regions began to crumble. Music deserves special attention, as an art form that flourished after the Inquisition. During the period of strict religious control, music had been largely confined to liturgical purposes. The Church approved of music that served worship, but was suspicious of secular music, particularly if it expressed sensual pleasure or emotional intensity that seemed worldly. Instruments themselves were sometimes suspect. The violin was considered dangerous because its voice seemed too human, too emotionally direct. The post-Inquisition period saw an explosion of musical creativity. Opera houses opened across formerly restricted regions. Composers wrote symphonies, concertos, and chamber music that explored the full range of human emotion. Folk music that had been practiced only in private or in rural areas where authorities were distant came into the open. Music education spread beyond cathedral schools to secular academies. The development of a concert-going public was revolutionary. During the Inquisition, public gatherings were always suspect. They might be covers for heretical meetings. The theatre and concert hall became spaces where people could gather without religious supervision, where they could experience beauty and emotion for its own sake rather than for spiritual edification. This created a new kind of community, bound by aesthetic appreciation rather than religious obligation. The natural sciences advanced with particular rapidity once freed from religious constraints. Biology could study life without needing to confirm biblical accounts of creation. Geology could examine the Earth's history without fitting findings into a 6,000-year timeline. Astronomy could map the heavens without needing to maintain the Earth's central position. Medicine could study the human body without theological restrictions. This didn't mean science and religion became immediately antagonistic. Many scientists remained devout believers who saw their work as uncovering God's design. But the requirement that scientific findings conform to religious doctrine was lifted. Scientists could follow evidence wherever it led and publish findings even when they challenged traditional beliefs. The result was an acceleration of scientific progress that transformed human understanding of the natural world. The development of evolutionary theory illustrates this change. Darwin's work built on decades of scientific investigation into geology, paleontology, and biology. The evidence for evolution became overwhelming precisely because scientists were free to collect data, share findings, and revise theories based on evidence rather than doctrine. Had the Inquisition remained powerful, evolution might have remained a dangerous speculation rather than becoming the foundation of modern biology. Medicine benefited enormously from freedom of inquiry. Dissection of human cadavers, long restricted by religious concerns, became standard in medical education. The germ theory of disease could be developed without needing to accommodate beliefs about disease as divine punishment. Anesthesia could be adopted without theological debates about whether pain was morally beneficial. Public health measures could be implemented based on scientific understanding rather than religious custom. The social sciences emerged as distinct disciplines in the post-Inquisition era. Sociology, anthropology, psychology. These fields became possible only when human society and behavior could be studied systematically without needing to confirm religious anthropology. Emil Durkheim could study religion as a social phenomenon. Sigmund Freud could propose psychological theories that minimized or ignored spiritual factors, and anthropologists could study diverse human cultures without presuming Christian superiority. This secularization of knowledge was controversial and remains so. Critics worried, and some still worry, that removing religious frameworks leaves society without moral foundations. The fear was that if everything is permitted to be questioned, then nothing will be held sacred, and social chaos will result. These concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Rapid secularization did create disorientation and sometimes nihilism. But the alternative, maintaining religious control over knowledge through persecution, had proven worse. The Inquisition hadn't created a virtuous society, it had created a fearful one. It hadn't preserved moral truth, it had prevented honest inquiry. The messy freedom that followed, with all its uncertainties and excesses, was preferable to the stifling certainty of enforced orthodoxy. Political philosophy underwent its own revolution. The Inquisition had been premised on the idea that religious and political authority were inseparable, that the state had both the right and the duty to enforce religious orthodoxy. This fusion of church and state seemed natural, even inevitable, for centuries. But the Enlightenment philosophers challenged this assumption, arguing for separation of religious and civil authority. John Locke's letter. Concerning toleration, written in the late 17th century while the Inquisition still operated in some regions, made the case that religious belief couldn't be coerced and that attempting to do so violated both individual conscience and sound governance. Voltaire, whose writings were banned by the Inquisition, savagely mocked religious persecution and argued for tolerance. These ideas, once dangerous heresies, gradually became accepted wisdom. The American and French revolutions, occurring as the Inquisition's power waned, enshrined principles of religious freedom and separation of church and state. These revolutions weren't primarily about religion, but they established political frameworks that made institutions like the Inquisition impossible. The idea that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, not from divine mandate, fundamentally altered the relationship between religious and civil power. The concept of human rights itself owes something to reaction against the Inquisition. The idea that individuals possess inherent dignity and rights that no authority, religious or civil, may violate, emerged partly from contemplating the Inquisition's abuses. If the Inquisition could torture and kill people for their thoughts, then clearly some limit on authority was needed. The language of rights provided that limit. Education about the Inquisition has itself evolved. For generations, Catholic children were taught either nothing about the Inquisition or were given apologetic accounts that minimized its severity and emphasized its noble intentions. Protestant children learned about it as an example of Catholic tyranny. Neither approach encouraged honest historical understanding. Modern education about the Inquisition tries for more nuance and accuracy. Students learn about the historical context that produced the Inquisition, the methods it employed, and its impact on society. The goal is neither to excuse nor to sensationalize, but to understand. This approach treats students as capable of grappling with difficult history and drawing their own conclusions about its meaning. The role of memory in preventing future atrocities is complex. Simply remembering that the Inquisition happened doesn't automatically prevent similar persecutions. The 20th century saw genocides and totalitarian terror despite everyone knowing about historical precedents. Memory needs to be active, critical, and connected to present circumstances to be effective. Holocaust education has grappled with similar questions. How do you teach about atrocity in ways that inform without paralyzing, that warn without sensationalizing? The best approaches connect past persecution to present concerns about prejudice, scapegoating, and authoritarianism. The Inquisition can be taught similarly, not as a historical curiosity, but as a warning about what happens when ideological certainty combines with political power and the suppression of dissent. The long-term trajectory from Inquisition to pluralism suggests grounds for cautious optimism. Europe moved slowly and unevenly but unmistakably from enforced religious uniformity toward acceptance of diversity. This wasn't inevitable. It required struggle, sacrifice, and the courage of people who insisted on thinking freely despite the danger. But it happened. Yet complacency would be dangerous. The impulses that created the Inquisition, the desire for ideological purity, the fear of difference, the willingness to use violence against those who think differently, remain present in human nature. They appear in new forms, justified by different ideologies, but the essential dynamic is familiar. Understanding the Inquisition helps us recognize these patterns when they emerge. The Inquisition also teaches about institutional dynamics. How does a bureaucracy of persecution develop? How do ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil? How do systems of terror maintain themselves across generations? These questions remain relevant for understanding modern authoritarian regimes and systematic human rights abuses. Personal testimony from those who lived through the transition provides invaluable insight. Some accounts come from memoirs written by people who had personal or family experience of the Inquisition. Others appear in letters, diaries, and court records. These voices remind us that the Inquisition wasn't an abstraction, but a reality that shaped individual lives. One account describes a woman whose grandmother had been tried by the Inquisition and acquitted, but whose family remained under suspicion for decades. The woman described the relief when the Inquisition's power finally ended, how her mother wept with joy, and how the family began slowly rebuilding connections with their community. But she also described the lasting damage, the gaps in family history where fear had prevented the passing down of stories, the relatives who had fled and never returned, the trust that had been shattered and never fully repaired. Another account, from a former priest who had witnessed inquisitorial proceedings, described his growing horror at what he saw and his eventual break with the church. He wrote of the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile Christian teachings about love and mercy with the reality of watching people tortured for their beliefs. When the Inquisition's power began to fade, he felt not triumph but exhaustion and grief for all the years he had remained silent. The transformation of public discourse was one of the most visible changes. During the Inquisition, conversations in public spaces were guarded and superficial. People discussed weather, crops, local gossip, but avoided anything that touched on religion, politics, or ideas. Even in private, within families, there was often caution. Children might accidentally repeat something dangerous, and who knew if a servant might be listening? As the threat receded, conversation changed. In coffeehouses and salons, people began discussing books, ideas, and current events with growing freedom. These spaces became incubators for new ways of thinking. A merchant might debate philosophy with a minor nobleman. A scientist might explain recent discoveries to an interested audience. A writer might test out ideas that would later appear in published work. This free exchange of ideas, impossible under the Inquisition, became the engine of cultural and intellectual progress. The coffeehouses deserve particular mention. They spread across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, becoming democratic spaces where, for the price of a cup of coffee, anyone could participate in conversation and debate. In London, Paris, Vienna, and eventually in Spanish and Italian cities, coffeehouses became alternative universities, places where ideas circulated freely and where reputations could be made or destroyed through the quality of one's arguments rather than the purity of one's orthodoxy. The Inquisition would have shut down such places immediately. Indeed, in some cities under strong religious control, there were attempts to do exactly that, with authorities recognizing the danger that free discussion posed to established order. But the coffeehouse culture proved too popular, too economically important, and ultimately too valuable as social institutions to be suppressed. They represented a new kind of public sphere, one that existed outside both church and state control. Letter writing became another vehicle for free expression. During the Inquisition, letters were dangerous. They could be intercepted, read by authorities, and used as evidence of heresy. The decline of the Inquisition made correspondence safer, and an explosion of letter writing followed. Intellectuals across Europe maintained extensive correspondences, sharing ideas, debating theories, and building networks of collaboration. These letters, many of which survive in archives, reveal the excitement of people discovering they could think and write freely. The epistolary novel emerged as a literary form, partly because letters had become associated with authentic expression. Richardson's Pamela and Laclose's Dangerous Liaisons used the letter format to create intimate psychological portraits that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The letter implied privacy, truthfulness, and freedom from external control, all values that the post-Inquisition era celebrated. Travel became easier and more common as religious persecution declined. During the Inquisition's height, traveling to regions with different religious affiliations was risky. A Catholic traveling in Protestant lands or a Protestant in Catholic regions might face suspicion, harassment, or worse. The need for religious passports and proof of orthodoxy made travel complicated and sometimes dangerous. As tolerance increased, these barriers fell. The Grand Tour, where young aristocrats traveled through Europe to complete their education, became possible. Scientists could visit colleagues in different countries. Artists could study in foreign academies. Merchants could expand their networks across religious boundaries. This mobility facilitated exchange of ideas and techniques, contributing to the dynamism of the post-Inquisition era. The development of historical consciousness itself was partly a result of the Inquisition's end. During the period of strict control, history was written to serve religious and political purposes. The past was mined for examples that confirmed present orthodoxies. Critical historical method, which examined sources skeptically and tried to reconstruct what actually happened rather than what should have happened, was dangerous because it might undermine official narratives. Once the threat passed, historians could begin examining the past more honestly. They could acknowledge inconvenient facts, challenge traditional accounts, and propose alternative interpretations. The study of the Inquisition itself became possible. Historians could examine inquisitorial records, interview survivors, and attempt to understand how and why the institution had operated as it did. This historical work served both scholarly and therapeutic purposes, helping societies understand their past and process their trauma. The rise of the novel as the dominant literary form of the modern era was intimately connected to the freedom that followed the Inquisition. The novel, with its focus on individual psychology, its exploration of social relations, and its implicit critique of established institutions, would have been impossible under strict religious censorship. Novelists required freedom to explore human nature in all its complexity, including its less admirable aspects. Don Quixote, written by Cervantes in the early 17th century, when the Inquisition was still powerful, had to navigate censorship carefully. Its critique of Spanish society was indirect, coded in parody and fantasy. By the 19th century, novelists could be far more direct. Stendhal could explore ambition and hypocrisy. Balzac could dissect the corruptions of society. Flaubert could examine the inner life of an adulteress. all without fear of the stake. The Gothic novel, which emerged in the 18th century, often used Catholic settings, monasteries, convents, inquisitorial dungeons, as locations for horror. These novels expressed Protestant anxieties about Catholicism, but also reflected a broader fascination with the recently ended era of religious persecution. The Gothic allowed readers to experience the terror of the Inquisition vicariously, safely, from the comfort of their reading chairs. This literary processing of historical trauma served an important cultural function. Poetry experienced its own liberation. During the Inquisition, poetry was expected to serve religious or moral purposes. Poets wrote hymns, devotional verses, and moral allegories. Personal expression was suspect. Passion was dangerous, and imagination was supposed to stay within approved bounds. The result was a poetry that was often formally accomplished, but emotionally constrained. The Romantic poets of the late 18th and 19th centuries exploded these constraints. Wordsworth celebrated individual perception and emotion. Byron wrote of passion and rebellion. Shelley proclaimed poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. These poets insisted that imagination and individual vision were valuable in themselves, not just as vehicles for moral instruction. This assertion of individual creative authority would have been heretical during the Inquisition. The theatre's transformation was particularly dramatic because theatre had always been suspect to religious authorities. It involved pretense, it appealed to emotions, it gathered crowds, and it often depicted sinful behavior even if it claimed to condemn it. Many inquisitorial regions had banned theatre entirely or restricted it to specifically religious plays. The reopening of theatres and the flourishing of dramatic art that followed the Inquisition's decline represented a reclaiming of public space for entertainment and artistic expression. Theatres became sites of cultural debate, where plays commented on contemporary issues and audiences responded with enthusiasm or outrage. The theatre could criticize authority, mock hypocrisy, and explore controversial subjects in ways that other media couldn't match. Opera combined music, theatre, and spectacle into an art form that the Inquisition would have found deeply troubling. Opera houses became temples to secular art, ornate buildings where society gathered not for worship, but for aesthetic experience. The operas themselves told stories of human passion, political intrigue, and moral ambiguity, hardly the stuff of religious edification. Yet opera became the prestige art form of the 19th century, suggesting how completely values had shifted. The visual arts moved from churches and palaces into museums open to the public. During the Inquisition, art served religious and aristocratic patrons. Painters depicted saints, biblical scenes, and portraits of the powerful. The range of acceptable subjects was limited, and the treatment of those subjects was governed by religious doctrine. Christ must be shown with dignity. Saints must be idealized. Even the naked human body must be rendered in ways that didn't provoke lust. Post-Inquisition art expanded in every direction. Genre painting depicted everyday life without needing to attach moral lessons. Landscape painting celebrated nature for its own beauty. Portraiture showed people as they were, rather than as idealized types. The nude, freed from strictly classical or religious contexts, could explore the human body as a subject of aesthetic interest. This expansion of subject matter and approach transformed what art could be and do. The Impressionists, appearing in the late 19th century, represented an even more radical break. They painted not what they knew, but what they saw, capturing subjective perceptions rather than objective reality. They used color and brushwork in ways that scandalized academic authorities. Their art was about vision, sensation, and the moment. Concerns that would have seemed frivolous or dangerous during the Inquisition, but that captured something essential about modern experience. Photography emerged in the 19th century as a new medium that the Inquisition never had to contend with. But had it existed earlier, photography would have posed fascinating questions. The camera could capture reality with unprecedented accuracy, including aspects of reality that might be disturbing or improper. Would inquisitors have banned photographs of the poor, the sick, the naked? Would documentary photography of social problems have been considered dangerous? We can only speculate, but the questions highlight how much freedom the new medium assumed. Scientific institutions proliferated in the post-Inquisition era. Academies of science, research institutes, observatories, botanical gardens, all of these represented organized support for free inquiry. During the Inquisition, scientific work had been scattered and individual, conducted by isolated researchers who had to be careful about what they published. The new institutions provided communities of scientists, resources for research, and platforms for disseminating findings. These institutions also established norms for scientific work: peer review, replication of experiments, publication of methods and data, openness to criticism and revision. These norms assumed a community of equals collaborating in pursuit of truth, a very different model from inquisitorial proceedings where authority determined truth and dissent was heresy. The scientific method itself, with its emphasis on evidence, skepticism, and revision, embodied values antithetical to the Inquisition. The professionalization of academic disciplines was another important development. During the Inquisition, there were scholars and natural philosophers, but fields weren't clearly demarcated and credentials were informal. The post-Inquisition era saw the emergence of distinct disciplines: physics, chemistry, biology, history, philosophy, literature, each with its own methods, standards, and professional organizations. This specialization brought both benefits and costs. It allowed for deep expertise and rigorous standards within fields, but it also created barriers between disciplines and sometimes led to narrow thinking. The polymath, the Renaissance ideal of someone who could work across multiple fields, became increasingly rare. Still, the overall effect was to advance knowledge more rapidly than had been possible under the Inquisition's restrictions. Medical education provides a clear example of this professionalization. During the Inquisition, doctors trained through apprenticeship and studying ancient texts, primarily Galen. New anatomical knowledge was slow to be incorporated because it contradicted traditional authorities. The post-Inquisition era saw the establishment of modern medical schools with standardized curricula, clinical training, and research laboratories. Doctors learned from observation and experimentation rather than just from books. The result was dramatic improvement in medical knowledge and eventually in health outcomes. Public health emerged as a field only when it became possible to study disease patterns systematically and to implement measures based on scientific understanding rather than religious belief. The cholera epidemics of the 19th century sparked research that identified contaminated water as the source of infection. Implementing solutions, building sewers, providing clean water, required overcoming religious objections that disease was divine punishment. The victory of scientific over religious explanations of disease represented a triumph for the post-Inquisition order. The transformation of cities reflected these broader changes. Medieval cities under inquisitorial control had been organized around religious institutions. The cathedral at the center, monasteries and convents throughout, guilds under religious patronage. Modern cities increasingly organized themselves around secular functions: commerce, industry, government, entertainment. The cathedral might remain physically central, but culturally it had been displaced. New institutions, libraries, museums, concert halls, theaters, coffeehouses, universities claimed space and attention. These secular temples suggested different values and priorities than the religious buildings that had dominated medieval cities. A person could now spend their day moving between secular institutions, engaging with culture and knowledge that had no religious content or purpose. This would have been unimaginable during the Inquisition. Urban planning itself became more secular. Instead of organizing space around religious functions, planners thought about traffic flow, sanitation, parks, and commercial efficiency. Baron Haussmann's redesign of Paris in the mid-19th century, with its grand boulevards and secular monuments, exemplified this new approach. The city became a machine for modern life rather than a stage for religious devotion. The growth of literacy was both cause and consequence of the Inquisition's decline. During the period of strict control, literacy was limited and carefully monitored. Teaching someone to read meant giving them access to potentially dangerous ideas. Books were expensive and heavily censored. The result was a largely illiterate population dependent on clergy to interpret texts. The spread of literacy in the post-Inquisition era transformed society. People could read for themselves, form their own opinions, access knowledge directly. This didn't immediately make everyone rational or enlightened. Literacy also enabled the spread of sensational and misleading content. But it shifted power from those who controlled access to texts toward individuals who could read and judge for themselves. Public libraries emerged as democratizing institutions, offering free access to books for anyone who could read. Andrew Carnegie's funding of library buildings across Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was based on the belief that literacy and access to books would improve society. This faith in the power of reading and knowledge reflected post-Inquisition values. The idea that truth was available to anyone who sought it, not just to religious authorities. Newspapers and periodicals created a reading public that followed current events and participated in public debate. During the Inquisition, news had been scarce, carefully controlled, and often months old. The post-Inquisition era saw the emergence of a daily press that covered everything from politics to science to arts to crime. Readers could follow debates, form opinions, and feel connected to events beyond their immediate community. The popular press sometimes disappointed the high hopes placed in it. Sensationalism, bias, and misinformation were problems from the beginning. But the existence of multiple competing newspapers meant that lies and distortions could be challenged and corrected in ways impossible under inquisitorial censorship. The marketplace of ideas, for all its flaws, proved more reliable than enforced orthodoxy. Advertising emerged as a new form of communication, using the freedoms that the post-Inquisition era made possible. Advertisers could make bold claims, appeal to desires and vanities, create images of the good life defined by consumption rather than piety. This commercialization of culture troubled some observers who worried that freedom from religious control had led only to control by commercial interests. The critique had some merit, but most people preferred the freedom to choose among commercial appeals to the terror of religious persecution. Consumer culture more broadly represented a shift in values. During the Inquisition, the Church preached asceticism and suspicion of worldly pleasures. Wealth was spiritually dangerous, luxury was sinful, and the proper focus was on the afterlife rather than this life. The post-Inquisition era saw a shift toward embracing material prosperity, celebrating innovation, and seeking happiness in this world. This shift troubled religious authorities, who saw it as materialism and moral decline. Critics of modernity have continued to make similar arguments, that freedom from religious control has led to spiritual emptiness, that material prosperity doesn't bring happiness, that consumer culture is shallow and destructive. These critiques deserve serious consideration, but few would trade the freedom and prosperity of the post-Inquisition era for a return to the religious terror that preceded it. The role of women in society slowly expanded, though progress was frustratingly slow and uneven. The Inquisition had enforced a particularly narrow vision of womanhood, with women expected to be silent, obedient, and confined to domestic roles. Women who were too educated, too independent, or too outspoken risked denunciation. The witch hunts, which overlapped with the Inquisition though they were somewhat distinct, specifically targeted women who didn't conform to approved roles. The post-Inquisition era didn't immediately liberate women, but it did create spaces for gradual progress. Women's education expanded slowly. Women began publishing under their own names, rather than anonymously or under male pseudonyms. Women formed associations and clubs where they could discuss ideas and organize for reform. The fight for women's suffrage in the 19th and 20th centuries built on foundations laid in the post-Inquisition period. The suffragists and feminists who fought for women's rights often drew on arguments about individual liberty and human rights that had been developed partly in reaction to religious persecution. If the Inquisition had been wrong to persecute people for their beliefs, then surely it was wrong to deny rights based on gender. The logic wasn't always accepted, and progress was slow. But the connection between freedom from religious persecution and other forms of liberation was real. The experience of sexual minorities shows similar patterns. During the Inquisition, sodomy was both a sin and a crime, punished with particular severity. People with same-sex attractions had to hide completely or face death. The post-Inquisition era saw very slow and uneven improvement In some places, laws became slightly less harsh. In others, persecution continued. But the general trajectory was toward greater tolerance, or at least toward separating sin from crime. The modern LGBTQ rights movement built on arguments about individual liberty, privacy and human dignity that emerged partly from reflection on past persecution. The recognition that the state shouldn't enforce religious views about sexuality, that individuals have the right to intimate relationships of their choosing, that people shouldn't be persecuted for their identities. These principles represent extensions of the freedoms won when the Inquisition ended. The development of modern democracy owes much to the post-Inquisition era's emphasis on individual rights and limits on authority. The Inquisition had represented unlimited authority, claiming divine sanction. No law constrained it. No appeal was possible, no sphere of life was private. The reaction against this absolutism helped generate constitutional government, separation of powers, bills of rights, and democratic participation. The American Constitution's First Amendment, protecting freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, can be read as a direct rebuke to inquisitorial practices. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen similarly emphasized individual liberty and limits on state power. These documents and the political systems they established made institutions like the Inquisition illegal, and their framers hoped impossible. But democracy proved more fragile than the founders hoped. The 20th century saw democratic systems collapse and totalitarian regimes emerge that committed atrocities on scales that dwarfed the Inquisition. The lesson is that freedom requires constant vigilance and defense, that institutional protections can be undermined, and that the human capacity for ideological fanaticism and organized cruelty didn't disappear with the Inquisition. The comparison between the Inquisition and 20th century totalitarianism is instructive. Both relied on ideology claiming ultimate truth. Both used terror to enforce conformity. Both created networks of surveillance and denunciation. Both destroyed lives for thoughts rather than actions. The differences matter too. Totalitarian regimes had far more efficient technologies of control and destruction. But the underlying dynamics were disturbingly similar. This suggests that the freedoms won after the Inquisition aren't permanent or automatic. Each generation must choose to maintain them, to resist the temptation of enforced conformity, to protect spaces for dissent and difference. The memory of the Inquisition serves as a warning, but only if we actively connect that history to present challenges. The question of how to maintain tolerance and freedom without sliding into relativism or nihilism has troubled societies since the Inquisition ended. If all beliefs are equally valid, if there's no basis for moral judgment, then what prevents chaos? This question led some thinkers to try to ground ethics in reason, nature, or universal human values, rather than in religious authority. Others maintained that religious belief remained essential, but argued it should be voluntary rather than coerced. The solution that emerged, liberal pluralism, with protected spheres of individual liberty and democratic procedures for resolving disagreements, has proven reasonably successful, but isn't universally accepted. Critics from various perspectives argue that liberalism is too thin, that it can't provide the thick communities and shared meanings that humans need. These critics may have a point, but few offer alternatives that don't risk recreating the coercive religious authority that the Inquisition represented. The modern secular state, which claims neutrality among different religions and philosophies while protecting individual rights, emerged partly from the experience of religious conflict and persecution. The idea was that the state should focus on maintaining order and protecting rights, while leaving questions of ultimate meaning to individuals and voluntary associations. This represented a dramatic narrowing of the state's ambitions, compared to the Inquisition's vision of enforcing religious truth. This secular state has achieved remarkable successes: peace among religions that previously slaughtered each other, protections for minorities, spaces for diversity and experimentation. But it also faces challenges. Some religious believers feel that secularism is itself an ideology being imposed on them. Others worry that without shared values, society will fragment. These concerns deserve attention. But solutions must respect the freedoms won when the Inquisition ended. Education about religious diversity and history became possible and eventually normal in the post-Inquisition era. During the Inquisition, learning about other religions was dangerous. It might lead to doubting one's own faith, or worse, to conversion. The post-Inquisition era saw the development of comparative religion as a field of study, where different faiths could be examined objectively, understood in their historical contexts, and appreciated for their contributions without requiring belief. This academic approach to religion troubled believers who worried it would undermine faith. And indeed, studying religion objectively did lead some people to question or abandon their beliefs. But it also enriched understanding, promoted tolerance, and helped people see the common human concerns underlying diverse traditions. Most people maintained their faith while gaining appreciation for other traditions. Interfaith dialogue, where representatives of different religions meet as equals to discuss common concerns and differences, would have been unthinkable during the Inquisition. The Catholic Church claimed to possess the one true faith, and engaging seriously with other religions would have implied relativism. The post-Inquisition era, particularly in recent decades, has seen increasing interfaith engagement, with religions working together on social issues while respecting their differences. The globalization that accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries brought different cultures and religions into closer contact than ever before. European colonialism spread Western ideas and institutions globally, often destructively, but it also exposed Europeans to the depth and sophistication of non-Western traditions, challenging assumptions of superiority. The post-colonial period has seen efforts, however imperfect, to build a truly global civilization that respects diversity while protecting universal human rights. The legacy of the Inquisition extends into current debates about religion, state power, and individual liberty. When authoritarian governments restrict religious practice, when religious extremists commit violence, when debates arise about the limits of free speech or the accommodation of religious practices in secular societies, in all these situations, the history of the Inquisition provides relevant lessons. The key lessons aren't simple. The Inquisition shows that religious persecution is evil and destructive, but it also shows that ideological persecution can come from any direction, religious or secular. It demonstrates the danger of certainty combined with power. It reveals how ordinary people can become complicit in atrocity. It proves that freedom and tolerance are precious and fragile, requiring constant defense. Some contemporary observers see parallels between the Inquisition and modern phenomena: cancel culture, political correctness, social media shaming. These comparisons are controversial and often overdrawn. There's an enormous difference between being criticized on Twitter and being burned at the stake. But there may be some validity to the concern that intolerance and coerced conformity can emerge in new forms, and that the spirit that animated the Inquisition, the desire to purge society of incorrect thoughts, hasn't entirely disappeared. Others see parallels between the Inquisition and religious extremism in the contemporary world. When terrorists claim to kill in God's name, when theocratic regimes impose religious law brutally, when girls are denied education because of religious edicts, these evoke the Inquisition's combination of religious authority and violence. The comparison helps us understand that the Inquisition wasn't a uniquely Catholic phenomenon, but an example of what can happen when any religious tradition gains unchecked power. The appropriate response isn't to condemn religion generally. Most believers throughout history have been peaceful and have contributed to human flourishing. Rather, it's to insist on the principles that emerged from the post-Inquisition era: freedom of conscience, separation of religious and state authority, protection for minorities, rule of law, prohibition of torture, limits on power. These principles aren't perfect or universally accepted, but they represent humanity's best efforts to prevent atrocities like the Inquisition from recurring. Art about the Inquisition continues to be created, suggesting that the trauma hasn't been fully processed or that it continues to offer lessons. Novels, films, plays, and visual art explore the Inquisition from various angles: the experience of victims, the psychology of persecutors, the social dynamics that enabled persecution, the resistance that persisted despite terror. These works serve both artistic and therapeutic purposes, helping audiences understand the past and connect it to present concerns. Some recent works have tried to humanize the Inquisitors, to understand their motivations beyond simple evil or fanaticism. This is controversial. Some argue that humanizing persecutors risks excusing them. But understanding how ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil seems essential for preventing it in the future. The Inquisitors believed they were serving God, protecting society and saving souls. They were wrong and their actions were monstrous, but they were human. That's the disturbing lesson. The question of forgiveness and reconciliation remains unresolved centuries later. Can the Catholic Church be forgiven for the Inquisition? Can individual inquisitors be understood in their historical context without excusing their actions? Should descendants of victims continue to demand acknowledgement and apology? There are no simple answers. The Church has made some gestures toward acknowledgement and apology, but many feel these haven't gone far enough. Others argue that dwelling on past wrongs prevents healing and reconciliation. The physical sites associated with the Inquisition, the buildings where tribunals met, the prisons where accused people were held, the places where executions occurred, raise questions about commemoration. Some have been destroyed, others preserved as museums or historical sites. Walking through these spaces today evokes complex emotions: horror at what happened, gratitude that it's over, determination that it not be repeated, but also questions about whether preservation glorifies or condemns, whether tourism trivializes or educates. The most powerful sites are often the simplest: plaques marking where pyres burned, lists of names of victims, quotations from those who suffered. These minimal memorials respect the dignity of the dead without spectacle. They invite reflection rather than mere horror. They serve as reminders that each name represented a full human life, with hopes and fears and relationships, all destroyed by ideological fanaticism. As we conclude this journey from silence to song, from the suffocating grip of the Inquisition to the first tentative breaths of freedom, what emerges is not a triumphalist narrative, but something more complex and human. The end of the Inquisition didn't immediately create a perfect society. It created one where people could begin to be fully human, to question, to create, to err, to grow. The song that Europe began to sing after the Inquisition wasn't always harmonious. There were discordant notes, false starts, competing melodies, but it was genuinely their song, arising from their own voices rather than imposed from above. The freedom to sing badly, to experiment, to find one's own voice. This was perhaps more valuable than any enforced perfection. The generations that lived through the transition from Inquisition to freedom understood something that we risk forgetting. Liberty is not natural or automatic, but achieved and maintained through struggle. They knew the cost of losing freedom, because they or their ancestors had lived under its absence. They valued it not as an abstract principle, but as lived reality. The difference between fear and safety, between silence and speech, between death and life. We inherit their freedom and their responsibility. The Inquisition is gone, but the human tendencies that created it remain. The attraction to certainty, the fear of difference, the temptation to enforce conformity, the conviction that our beliefs justify our violence. Recognizing these tendencies in ourselves and our societies, and choosing to resist them, is how we honor those who suffered under the Inquisition and those who fought for freedom. The song continues. Each generation adds its verses, harmonies, and innovations. The melody started when the smoke cleared, and a merchant's daughter picked up a forbidden book, has become a symphony of human voices, diverse and sometimes discordant, but profoundly free. That freedom, purchased at such terrible cost, defended with such courage and used with such creativity, remains both our inheritance and our responsibility. From silence to song, this journey wasn't inevitable or complete. There are still silences to be broken, songs to be sung, freedoms to be won, but the journey itself, from the darkness of the Inquisition to the light of freedom, stands as proof that humans can learn from their worst mistakes, can build better societies, and can choose liberation over oppression. That proof, that hope, is the Inquisition's ultimate legacy. Not the terror it inflicted, but the freedom its end made possible.